All right, welcome back to You Can't Say That, and following up from this past week's discussion in Social 19, and feeling really good about the week. Had two great classes, and we had two interesting guests yesterday, and A.J. Wagner was in class, a former judge from Ohio, and Jared Odrick, who is a student here at Penn State and has had a roundabout journey through the league, as he would say, and as you call it, right, Jared? So first off, welcome. And Gary Adler, professor of sociology at Penn State, who is supervising some research here at Penn State in Jared's final class that he's taking, and putting this project together and linking it with this other work that he's doing, which is fascinating and we're going to talk about. But just so, thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, so Jared, just to kind of weave us into where we're going to go, what'd you think about class yesterday, or what was your experience?
It was very interesting. I actually was just watching some of the playback in the other room, and you end up seeing how much, or I end up seeing how much I was stuttering at the beginning. You know, because I told them it's easier for me, and I think for a lot of players it's a similar way. It's easier to go play in front of 110,000 people than it is to speak in front of 500 or 20. And I think a part of that is because our masks are off. Mm-hmm. And our masks are off, and we don't nearly have as much practice and natural ability. I think, you know, what I used to play in football was obviously a God-given size and athleticism. That, you know, was then practiced and cultivated into something that was a professional athlete. But I think playing football came more naturally than speaking in front of people. But I think it went well. But by the end of it, I was flowing and going. And I think I spoke a little too much maybe, but it was good.
No, it was awesome. In fact, you know, as often happens, it's about 45 minutes in that the real good conversation starts, and I think had we had more time for student questions, it would have been really interesting.
Around for like an hour after class.
A huge group of people
spoke to about 50 kids for about another hour after class, which was great because I got to ask, you know, very single, intimate questions.
Yeah, it's awesome that I think students always are looking outside the box, and for people who are outside the box to try to get some questions answered that they have just about life and living life. And so what do you have for, I know that you had a series of questions. I can go in different directions, but I know you had some things that you also wanted to ask me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the way I saw this conversation and me, you know, coming back on campus, I knew that I had two people that I could look to in order to kind of solidify some of my search for answers in this documentary that I'm making, I guess, about CTE. You know, it's really about a transition from football to the rest of society. And I mentioned that to both of you. And, you know, we did an interview. We actually sat down and spoke back in 2018 at the outset of this in Brooklyn, and which I'm very thankful for because, you know, it provided me a lot of perspective on how to move forward from there, and also helped me not waste more money on production cost moving forward too, and trying to get more specific about the questions that I actually did want to ask. But I think what's been interesting is, it feels like the missing link to my search for answers right now is the sociological perspective from professors on campus that have made a career out of asking the types of questions that this documentary now needs. And because I know that when I was explaining myself and some of the hunches that I had about what I had seen and what I had heard from the people I've interviewed, from, you know, neuroscientists to former players to MMA fighters, to functional medicine doctors, all types of people, you know, but
angels are calling.
Yeah. So, and so the thing is, it's kind of like, it's really been interesting to see what I've been deducing from all those different conversations, and then to get here. And as soon as I explained to you about what I've been doing, I think you had like 3 theories and books right away that pertain to my questioning of CTE. Because what I'm questioning, right, are the behavioral symptomologies being attached to the definition of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a neurodegenerative disease being attached to former football players along all levels of interaction with the sport, from high school to college, but especially professional. And the reason this whole thing started, me questioning this thing about CTE, is because in 2017, I was considering retiring after being released from the Jaguars. And I was in my house alone in Toronto, trying to figure out, well, what next if I don't want to answer these calls from other teams calling? The Jets were calling, the Eagles were calling, the Patriots were calling. And it's like, well, if I don't want to pick up those phone calls, then what next? And I didn't know. So what does one do? And they start going to, or I start going to seek out answers online. And I'm putting in words into, all hail. Sorry.
No, you can keep going.
Oh, okay, good. You just freelance like that. I like it.
I'm just going to tell them to shut up.
Yeah. And, what? Well, I kind of wanted Sam to be in here for this because I think he, I'd love to hear what the combination of you has been so awesome, because I honestly feel like the way I'm sitting right now is that the way I've envisioned this is left brain and this is right brain, right? Where he's over here and he will talk with his hands a little bit more and grab something and bring it to you. Where I feel like when I speak to you, it's a bit more, somebody had said this before, and here's a line where that begins and ends. And then here's a line where this theory begins and ends. And then I think you could ask this question and that question. So it's kind of funny.
And you should know that's fun for us too, because we've been dancing around each other for 4 years. I think this is the most time we spent with each other, actually. This is great.
So I guess just to end how this all started was, I'm in Toronto trying to figure out, well, what's my new narrative? What's my new narrative? Who am I, and what can I go do? So I start looking for retired NFL football players. I start looking for former NFL football players because I want to know what they're doing now. What are they doing now? What's interesting? Because I didn't want to be a commentator. Mm-hmm. It wasn't very attractive for me to go back to the game in the same way and continue the character that I've already been. I wanted to change my mind. I wanted to become somebody else. And what I kept seeing more often than not was CTE in all my searches. And maybe I was, it was too shallow of a search using Google. But I think that's probably one of the main ways that people kind of look for information. And then whether you call that lazy or not, like, my father didn't play football, so I can't look to him, and I didn't have football players in my family. So who do I look to as for this transition, transitional period in my life? And who to look to? It's like, all right, well, there's Jesse the Body Ventura. He became, like a substantial, public figure, I guess, and a conspiracy theorist. And I guess that's what I'm attempting to do and not do, is I'm attempting to question as hard as a conspiracy theorist, but legitimize my questioning and my sentiments more than that. And so I'm not considered a conspiracy theorist just by questioning something that I believe should be questioned, which is the validity of the narrative surrounding CTE, because it almost seemed inevitable that was my fate after 7 years of professional football and 17 years of playing football in total. So that's what led me to start all this questioning.
So why don't we do this? Why don't you give us the elevator pitch of what your project is, and then I want to hear from you. Let's just start right with you, Gary, what you're thinking about it. So, Jared, give us the elevator pitch so the people who are listening have a sense of, okay, what is it that they're talking about?
Well, after stating what I just stated, it's kind of like, and I don't want to think this. I really don't. But from my conversations, it's hard for me not to imagine that there are groups of scientists that are using the NFL's junkyard of broken bodies and individuals lost of purpose to create a new pharmaceutical market. And attaching these behavioral symptomologies to a disease, a neurodegenerative disease that football causes, that playing football and hitting your head through subconcussive hits causes. I'm calling that into question because I believe there's a lot of other people. I believe and know there are higher rates of suicide, of depression, of irregular moods and bipolar symptomologies amongst the general population and other groups and cohorts of people than professional football players. And I'm wondering why it's such a large national narrative. And I'm also wondering how many people who are football players who are considering that they have CTE downloaded those thoughts from narrative or from science.
Okay, so let me see if I can take this then. So somewhere along the way, starting a few years ago, it seems to me it's about 10 years ago, right? Wasn't it Mike Webster, the center for the Steelers, is the first one that really sort of put this on the, as I recall, put this on the map. The idea is that getting your head knocked around for a good portion of one's life creates a neurodegenerative process that leads to distinct transformations in degeneration of the brain, which leads to behavior and memory loss and all sorts of negative outcomes, and then ultimately early death. And what you're saying is, hey, so I've studied sociology here, and I'm a student, and increasingly I'm a student not only of sociology, but of what is really the interstices of thinking. All the, the sort of the interconnected tissue of thinking, right? So the places where different thought systems interlap. And I'm saying, okay, that's the simple. So this is you, right? That's the simple explanation. Is we get our heads knocked around, it leads to an degenerative disease of some sort, right? But maybe there's something else, right? Maybe I don't know. I just have this intuitive sense from what I'm seeing that there are other things that are happening sociologically and psychologically and institutionally in people's lives, the lives of players. And you and I have talked a lot about what some of those are, right? And we can flesh that out a little bit. But there might be some other things going around or that are happening that would mean that there are other causal factors and forces in play and not just banging our heads that might lead to some of this degenerative disease, or some of the behaviors that people, ex-players, former players, or current players might exhibit may actually not be from CTE. It might be from other things. And so let's explore some of that.
And if I can jump on that. So one thing, when Sam first told me about your topic, and as we first started talking about it, it was important for me to disaggregate the phenomena you're interested in describing, which, as you narrated, is how does a professional athlete who has suffered injuries during their career, when the career ends, how do they transition? What comes next? I wanted to disaggregate that from what's clearly your suspicion and concern that the vulnerable people who are making that transition are going to be merchandised, or that there's going to be an industry built off of them. Because what struck me is, and I told you this the other day, you woke me up a little. You got me thinking, because I've been following a little of the CTE stuff, and it's everywhere, which is part of your point. And it seemed to me, from a kind of a lay reader of the biological science, is that there's a there. But what I think is interesting about your question is you're wondering if the scientific concept that's developing, you're wondering if that's taken on a life of its own, and it's now doing things to people instead of for people. And so what I was really intrigued about was
That's a nice way to put it, by the way.
yeah. I had to kind of wrap my mind around it because we were talking the other day. I'm a little like, I don't know. I've heard some of the empirical science, what little I've read, that there does seem to be a syndrome there defining. And I would look into that more personally before I question that part of it. But as a sociologist, what I'm fascinated about is, without a doubt, there's a lot of people going through transitions and how do they get through it. And I think that you picked up on a reality that for athletes, CTE is providing what we'd call this frame, right? A strong narrative frame to make sense in the chaos of the absence of the frame that somebody like you lived for 29 years of your life, or almost a quarter century of your life in one frame: football, and it ends. And where do you go for something else to make sense of reality?
Yeah, I think a lot of what that's exactly. I love when I hear other people explain it better than I. But I'm asking because a part of my search for answers is not just for the narrative of all these players, but obviously myself, and questioning, what am I feeling? What can I give that to? What can I describe that as? And how do I know that this is not a part of some psychosocial shift in my life in which I'm trying to rein in and figure out, is it me just recognizing that I'm not as well developed as a person as I thought I was? Is it me not actually having the interests that I said that I had in all my interviews? Right? Am I waking up to the cognitive dissonance that is my life, that is my mouth and my movements, and the distance in between those two things? And so I started asking myself that, and I watched an interview of Larry Johnson Jr., the running back that played here at Penn State, and his interview, I think it was with one of these, either CBS or ABC or NBC, that talked about, I believe I have CTE, and he started listing off his behavioral symptomologies. But then it was hard for me not to look back throughout his career, and also from the stories that I have heard through his father being my coach, as well as on campus and through the team, of the behaviors that have gone on and some of the things that he got into in and around his career that he doesn't shy away from, that he talks about. But what makes a person want to point to a neurodegenerative disease instead of the behaviors that you've displayed for a lifetime? And to me, it seems that a lot of times, and I learned this term from watching probably too much Jordan Peterson, but that tyranny presents itself with a mask of compassion, right? And that sometimes what seems compassionate can actually be more tyrannical to ourselves, which is when we have an exoneration narrative, like, oh, it's this thing in my brain in which I can't control, so therefore I can't do anything about my behaviors, and I don't have responsibility over those things. And now this larger entity of sport is responsible for my malfunction. I felt like if I said that to myself, even if it were true, that I'd be making myself powerless. And I would not be giving myself any ability to do anything about who and what I am and my experiences, and for me to reframe who and what I am, that I'm giving that power up to larger entities than myself. And that's what I was concerned with.
Yeah. And when you talk about the tyranny of the industry, right, of pharmaceuticals and medicine and so on, it's an industry, man. It is driven by profit. Right, and it's driven by power.
Purdue Pharma. Just this week in the news with the settlement around the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
You realize that, right?
Yeah. And it is, and this makes, the folks who are questioning climate change, right, who are thoughtfully questioning, are right on point, and we need them to thoughtfully question, because we can jump into the waters and just go and not say, well, hang on a second, let me try to swim upstream a little bit, or at least pull off to the side and just let those raging waters go by and say, is that really the way I want to go, just because everybody else is and it looks like I should be going that way? So I am a contrarian always, and whenever I find myself thinking like everybody around me, I stop and I say, hold on, man, you need to back up a little bit.
About you being a contrarian, it's something that I really respect and I really like, and that I wanted to point out in this podcast that I appreciated about yesterday and having the opportunity to speak at your class. And it kind of seems like a a backhanded compliment to say, but I really do think it's a true compliment, in which I appreciate you being the embodiment of a moral gray area that allows students to think. And you presenting, being the devil's advocate a lot of times and pulling people back in towards this gray area in which you seem to exist on this campus in order to facilitate thinking. And I really appreciate that.
Can I be? I'm not often a contrarian,
Yeah.
but I want to be a little bit of contrarian here. And I think devil's advocate is one way to think about the intellectual and social purpose of being contrary. So the devil's advocate is literally a position, and you might know this. You said you were at the Vatican recently. Is a position that developed within the institution of Roman Catholicism, probably the oldest existing social institution in the world at this point, and whose sole purpose was to anybody who was put up for sainthood was to dig up all the dirt possible on that person to show all the reasons why they shouldn't be a saint. Because to be a saint within that tradition is certain forms of purity that should be shown. But the devil's advocate isn't contrary just to be contrary, though. So like when you were talking about questioning climate change, I agree of the importance of questioning how we, our ability to know that it's occurring. Because I think in that questioning, especially at university, you're more likely to realize that we do know that we can measure how it's occurring. And then we can get to arguing in a good contrarian nature about what to do about it. So it's contrariness for a purpose, right? And I think that's what your project is about. So the parallel that keeps coming up for me, partly again, just reading news stories this week, is PTSD. There's a similar kind of scientific history in the sense of a medical phenomenon being defined that is vague. The symptomology is not always the same in every case, but it was the contrarian nature of the science and defining that allowed us to develop an institution where we could deal with it. And I don't know anybody that would be contrarian about the validity of PTSD now.
I do.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, there are plenty
And I
of
spoke
people.
to
Really?
them,
Okay.
and I spoke to
That's great to know, because my frame of reference. So this is good for me, because my frame of reference is stories like one in the New York Times this week about a guy who lost, their buddies in Afghanistan, and he didn't see the symptoms of PTSD or whatever. My sense is that what's important in this conversation is reading when the medical industry can use science and a scientific concept for good things, and when it starts to go off the rails and becomes
Use
about
it for
power
profit.
or profit,
Yep.
or to mislead, to use kind of the phrase from Peterson. That
And then same with the climate change movement, right? I mean, all the movements. I mean, it's which is why we have to keep questioning, because like for example, the answers to climate change might be on the some fringe idea that we would never get to without people questioning sort of the core way of thinking, and that for me is. And I'm with you. There's got to be a purpose to contrarian thinking.
Yeah.
Like I'm an iconoclast. I always call myself an iconoclast, but there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
It's my job to get people to question anything that they think is tradition and good. And like my goal as a teacher, every day in every single class, is to get students to argue with me.
Yeah.
Like the kid yesterday who you were talking to. I want you to argue with me. I want you to leave class. I want you to have me in your head. I want to be in your head so much that you just got to argue with me until you get back to the next class. And I present a series of ideas that supersede the ones that were there, and now you start a new argument. And if I can get everybody to do that, then I've succeeded as a teacher.
There's two things that I really wanted to bring up, if you don't mind me stepping off camera for 1 second.
Hey, do we?
This episode is brought to you by Golden Conversation.
So you're aware of George Lakoff?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so
Are you okay with your mic like that? Or would you-
yeah, I'm fine.
Okay,
I'm
good.
fine.
All right.
So this is "Don't Think of an Elephant" by George Lakoff.
Yeah.
I wanted to read the whole book, but I stopped because the first chapter was exactly what I had been looking for. Because I had asked an employee of mine who's at NYU psychology, has her master's from NYU for psychology, and I talked about. I said a series of words, and she goes, "Oh, that sounds like framing." And I'm like, okay, well, who talks about framing? And she's like, well, there's a guy at NYU that talks about it, George Lakoff, right? And what he talks about, this is actually, it's almost like a guideline for Democrats and liberals to reframe their arguments as good as Republicans and conservatives frame their arguments, because their framing is off, and that's why there's a weakening of the Democratic Party. And I mean, and so what I saw from that was framing. When you frame something, right, in a particular way, and I know that you had said the word framing, you can, by framing something a proper way, you can then extract both the positive and negative energy of the words that you're using. Don't think of a big blue flying elephant. Don't think of a big blue flying elephant. Don't think of a big blue flying elephant. And then all you end up thinking, obviously, is a big blue flying elephant. So the thing is that how many times CTE is repeated? It's where it's, hey, we did this study and it's ravaging brains, but there's always an asterisk at the end of all those studies, and all of those news reports saying, but hey, they didn't have a control group, so we don't know.
Right.
So we don't know. But they've already said everything and laid out what's supposed to be happening to you as a football player who's confused.
So one of the things that you said, I want to hear Gary's, your take on this. One of the and by the way, if you're watching the stream today, we are really focusing on the work of Jared Odrick, and also having Gary Adler, Professor Adler here. So we're kind of going in a very unique direction, and I see some of the questions coming in on the screen. We'll get to those. We'll come back to them next week. And Jake, who was a student in class yesterday, I know you asked that one question. I'll make sure he answers that. So one of the things that I talked last week in class on Tuesday, I talked about the simplistic sociology and then the more interesting sociology.
Logging this one out.
Something just dropped over the cable.
Gotta plug in this. Yeah, I got you.
Did I step on it?
Doesn't matter which one.
We probably lost what you just said.
All right. So we're back. Okay, so on Tuesday's class, I was talking about kind of understanding differences because of perspectives, right? And so, look, I am. This is basic sociology, social demographics, right? You and I are white men, and we have a different experience of the world than Jared does. I mean, that's a given, right? Rich people different than poor people, one after the other. I mean, okay, got it, right? You just see, you understand the world from a certain perspective. But the more interesting sociology is the stuff that we can't, that we're searching for. Not all sociologists, because I'm convinced not all of us see this, but it's the invisible stuff, the invisible lines of forces and of causality that a lot of us don't turn to because we can't touch them, we can't feel them, we can't measure them, we can't even know them. So this is like the classic. In class, I talked about Durkheim. This is the only sociologist I ever talk about in class, ever, and in a whole semester.
This week was Durkheim in my class, actually. This is great.
Just the idea that somehow these invisible factors and forces are shaping even our most personal and private decisions, like the decision to take our own lives, right? That nobody would ever imagine could possibly be true. And yet, I'm never going to be thinking about killing myself and think, whoa, hang on. The suicide rate last year is the same as this year, and it's basically going to be the same as next year, which means that somehow society is determined already that a certain number of people are going to step up and kill themselves, and that means that somehow there are forces at play leading to 50 million or 50,000 Americans to kill themselves, right? This year and next year. Well, who's the 50,000? If that's the case, then there are forces that are leading me to commit suicide, that are leading me to this place where I might take my own life that I'm not responsible for. And so if that's the case, then why am I thinking about taking my own? It's not me. There's something else in play, and that's the sociological forces. You'll never see them, you'll never understand them. And then what we do in sociology is say, well, hang on, maybe we can't understand. Let's keep looking, right? Let's keep looking for correlation, and maybe we'll turn that correlation to causality, and we'll look at all sorts of things like religion and group connectivity and so on and so forth, right? Well, Jared, this research that you're looking at is really the invisible strings. Like, you're seeking something that, hey, I got the CTE thing. That, okay, clearly there's something. It's not good to get your head knocked around. We know that, okay? PTSD, right? We know when you go through trauma, okay, this is just not a good thing. But not everyone has the same experience.
Right.
And people get the same number of concussions and nothing happens to them.
Right.
And so what is happening here? And the medical establishment is always going to say, just like they say when one person's cancer responds to drug A and the next person has the same cancer, the cancer has the same DNA and it doesn't respond to drug A. And they say, well, that's just the mystery of it. No, we live in a world of science, of cause and effect, and we don't stop studying things until we find the absolute tiniest pieces of causality.
But I think there are places where there are end ranges. There still are end ranges.
There are.
But I think that's exactly where narratives take place.
Exactly.
Narratives that satisfy us.
Exactly.
And to go back to Durkheim, narratives are especially powerful in the moments when somebody has left a social group.
Yeah.
So in these, we were talking on my class today about rites of passage, right? And your project is really about the inverse of rites of passage. It's going through a space, a time in your life where there is no structure, there's no ceremony, there's no witness to it, there's no community to support it. And what struck me about your project is it makes sense that CTE, which has been, has gotten lionized or been kind of made sacred in a Durkheim sense by the medical community. So this disease has been named, right, and has some power. It makes sense that something like that would be powerful in a moment where people are lost.
Yeah.
Which is where you started off today.
Yo,
Exactly.
Jared, that idea right there, that's gold.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think.
and that's what I said. As soon as I started speaking to both of you guys about this,
Yeah, yeah.
It felt like there was legitimacy to my thoughts.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
There was legitimacy to me being, instead of me just being this conspiracy theorist, in his house in Toronto smoking a joint, thinking about what's next, right? And so there's so many things going through my mind right now that I want to connect to and really talk about. Like, I want to get back to Durkheim, but also I want to get back to what you talked about with the contrarians with PTSD.
Yeah.
Because
Which I wasn't so familiar with, as it's clear
Yeah.
that you guys are.
well, another person fortified my search for answers through a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And Sebastian Junger is a wartime journalist and anthropologist that made a documentary called Restrepo. I think that was nominated for an Oscar, but then he also wrote a book called Tribe, and he talked about on homecoming and belonging, it was called. And so he talked about his experiences at war and other people around him, and talked about how there had been other aspects of of what is described as PTSD being shown in different time frames of American and Westernized history. And he framed the issue with talking about, he framed it by talking about when America was being colonized, that there was an imbalance in the crossover between native tribal living and colonial living, and that there were exponentially more colonialized people going, either being captured or willingly going to live with the tribal natives because they felt that it was a more full and complete living, right? And so what he talked about is that he feels that it's not what happens to soldiers at war, it's what happens to them when they come back, right? And they come back from having a more real experience as a soldier, and nothing is as real, because when you wake up, it matters. When your shoes are tied, it matters. Having breakfast matters. Being awake on post matters, right? All of these things matter every single waking minute, right? And lives are at play. Things are actually at risk. And when you come back to a Western society, this lonely, individualistic society, where you can actually claim a disability and not have to do anything and make money,
And someone tells you you have a disability.
and someone tells you have a disability, that's the number one way to ruin a person, is to pay them to do nothing, right? And he recognized that I must be able to instill my life with some type of purpose for me not to have these symptoms. And he got a lot of backlash for saying, I got over my PTSD. I got over it.
Yeah. So, and that's not to say that it's not real for some people.
No,
that
of
it's
course.
not happening. Man, it's traumatic.
And one
in
of the
fact, next
Sorry.
month, a good friend of mine will be visiting here at Penn State again, Bassem Razo, and he had such a, he had, my gosh, his story is profound. His story of suffering, of loss in Iraq. I'll talk to you about it after the podcast, but. Yeah, it's real for some people, but why isn't it real for everybody? And so once it's not real for everyone, you got to say, okay, hang on a sec. Now we got to come at this from a different angle.
Yeah,
because
and this is something we've been talking about with your course project. Is I know you've been doing these interviews, but finding variation in the types of people you interview to be able to test your working hypothesis that CTE is embraced as a frame, or as Lakoff would say, as kind of a metaphorical frame for what's wrong with them. And we were kind of working through some ideal types the other day, where you expect the Peyton Mannings or Michael Strahans, the guys who are able to turn the page really quickly, right? They've been beat up too, but they were able to kind of seamlessly and willfully move into other careers. We would expect that maybe folks like that, the CTE narrative isn't so important. But there's a class of guys for whom that page doesn't turn quick. And maybe this is the majority of guys, even guys that have had really successful careers like you. Mm-hmm. And as you said the other day, they're left with suffering that doesn't have a justification or meaning anymore. Mm-hmm. And it may be for these guys, even if down the road their brains are shown to have CTE, or if they're not, that the narrative now still gives them a way to talk about it that we don't have it. I think that was one of the best things out of our conversation the other day, was trying to get to how it can work as this package of meaning for people.
And you were talking, I think what you had said, and I actually wrote down right here, is talking about how we talked about the three groups. One group, and that would be that those who need to use their body again, like a guy like I interviewed, like Chris McCain, right, who's now an MMA fighter, who's a former teammate of mine with the Dolphins, who pushes the idea of CTE out of their mind. Yeah. It's just not, I can't accept that. Mm-hmm. And I won't accept that because I need to go beat somebody's ass today, right? And so then guys like Peyton Manning and Michael Strahan, who are what I think you described as a negative case, of CTE, that would really highlight these other two groups because they've transferred into different roles in society seamlessly. And those people actually highlight what I like to talk about. Well, CTE seems to be a proper narrative in the absence of Super Bowl rings and Hall of Fame jackets. When you don't have these symbols that connect to a larger meaning that explain and justify your suffering, well then what narrative is there to justify my suffering? And in comes CTE. And so then that describes group three. Group three is CTE as an exoneration narrative and a way to express suffering that was never present before. That you could never express suffering as a football player because it was always wrapped up in a different type of meaning, right? That your suffering was valid and it was honorable, but it wasn't seen as suffering. It was seen as something that you did for the team, that you gave up for the team and for maybe even money. But the thing is that there's these three groups that we tried to make distinct and potentially then placing up next to one another and whatnot. And I'm not sure if you guys have anything to continue off of that, but I wanted to say something else to what you had said earlier, which was, part of what Sebastian Younger was talking about with PTSD. And he started talking about ADD and ADHD and how these things come about and become legitimized. And one of the passages in his book talks about, and I may be paraphrasing a bit here, but he talks about the pathology of Western society is that we end up only legitimizing the things that we can monetize. So when he starts talking about ADD and ADHD, he's like, well, nobody's talking about longer recesses or classes outside. We're not trying to change the structure in which we learn, right?
Yep.
We can't calculate those things.
Less testing. Right?
We can't calculate those things. Yeah, less testing. We can't. Those aren't calculable. But what we can do is create a pill, right? That not only shows how superior we are as human beings
And
to
how smart
create.
we are.
Yes,
Yep.
how smart
to
we are
control each other.
to control what we can do by creating a drug
Yeah.
that can then put asses in seats. And guess what else that does? You can count how many pills you can put in a bottle, and you can put a price on each one of them.
Yep.
So that's I think
or
one
get-
of the hidden mechanisms that you talk about.
Yeah.
Right? Are these hidden why does this happen?
Yeah.
And it's like, why does he have ADHD and he doesn't, yet they came from the same womb with eating the same food?
And what we do is we have to justify. We have to seek the causal forces and factors that lead so many more kids to have ADD, let's say today, and behavioral issues than they did 30, 40 years ago. And so we're seeking it. Is it in the food? Is it in the water? How about maybe it's just in the profit of the drug companies, But I don't know. Again, this is me. My job in this world is to question and to question power. That's the nature of what we do as sociologists. And so I have one. How about just the new medical marijuana industry?
Yeah.
It's all the companies, they're all owned by 99.9% of ownership is white people and increasingly rich white people. And it just makes me say, hold on a second.
Yeah. I happened to live in LA when it must have been 10 or 12 years ago when LA first okayed dispensaries, and it was like the Wild West because there was no regulation around it, right? And so it's literally, they were just popping up everywhere. And within a couple of years, LA had what I think is the right institutional response, which is you have to channel these things, especially when money gets involved, right?
Yeah.
Because there's
Yeah.
nothing like the market's desire to creep and to monetize all parts of our lives.
Oh man, I'm a licensed caregiver in the state of Pennsylvania, so I can take medical marijuana patients under my wings. I can go to the dispensary. I get their prescription filled for them. I make decisions about what it is that they should try, that sort of thing, right? And I go in and I read. Okay, well here's this. What's that?
Yeah, but you don't live here anymore, Jared.
So like, okay, well, try this. Would be really good for painting your left knee, but this one's good for painting your right knee. I mean, it's just a bunch of potheads that have come together and just created this, but it's driven by the corporate rich and mostly rich white folks, right? And I don't want to bring race into it, but that's what it is, right? Let's talk about it. And
when it comes down to mental health diagnosis like ADD and ADHD, there's
all
a
of that
separate
stuff.
conversation around minoritized groups being more diagnosed and pushed to have
exactly.
And in
medication.
schooling nowadays, too, there's a real hot area of research is around the overwhelming inequality in minority children who get sent to detention. I mean, the kind of basic discipline stuff and how much of an inequality is there. This is the stuff that grabs our attention as sociologists because the variation points out that there's some social force going on.
something.
And that's what we want to get to.
So as much as so here's the thing, I don't know how much impact I've ever had in my life on anything, but the medical marijuana movement in the United States, I actually think I may have had a really critical role in that because. No, seriously, I'll just say this. I've never really said this publicly, but so the person who started the marijuana policy project was a student of mine, and he came back into town. He was a student in 1992, I think, and he came back into town. He started the marijuana policy project inside the Beltway, right? And they're like, we're going for it. And at that point in time, NORML and the other legalization we've gone way off tangent, but I'll just tell the story because we're here. So they just were they just weren't really doing anything. And he said, no, I'm going for it. So he and this other, this colleague of his, they were both like these 4.0 students here at Penn State. And they said, we're going to really jumpstart this thing. So they went. After about 3 years, they were making a lot of progress. Comes back into town and says, listen, come work for us. What do you think about coming to work for us? And I said, no, that's not my shtick, right? I'm here. I'm supposed to be here. But I said, well, I'll give you some advice. And I said, my advice is you go toward medical. Don't go toward legalization, man. Everything is medical. That's the only thing that's ever going to win the battle. Man, medical, 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 medical. That's it. Never talk about anything but medical. And now, he may have already had that idea, but they went back and they went medical all the way. And medical is the reason the thing really took off. And I sometimes look back and I think, wouldn't that be awesome if that was that conversation, that I really had that, right? And then now I look at what's going on and I say, I'm not so sure that we're like on the right path. You know, I've been smoking weed since I was 12 years old, right? I mean,
it's tough.
So it's
tough. It's tough because you start to see, other forces coming in to influence what, not just what cannabis is, but the meaning that we're attaching to all of these things and how strong that is, and like I could go in so many different directions right now in terms of the people that I've been speaking to and the books that I've been reading, in terms of what we attach meaning to and how much it actually affects our biochemistry. When we actually have meaning. And one guy that I've been reading is Norman Doidge, who's a neuroscientist, I think in Toronto. And what he says in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself, he studies placebo effects, heavy placebo effects of depression pills. And he talks about there's a 52% efficacy. How do you say that? Help me out.
Efficacy.
Efficacy. There we go. Efficacy rate with actual pills, with actual.
In almost every study that we do on pharmaceuticals.
And then 47% with the placebo pills, the sugar pills.
Yeah.
And that it's not that far off from the real thing, where people are actually saying and reporting that they're feeling better, that they're doing better, that they're thinking straighter, simply because they believe that they
Listen,
are.
man, if I have a bad headache and I get an aspirin out, before I even swallow the aspirin, the headache's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes I'll stop and I won't swallow the aspirin. Headache will come back a little bit, and then I'll do it again. I'll swallow it, and at that moment, it's gone forever. It never lasts beyond me, just the first swallow of the aspirin. Now, okay, that's just me. It's one
No, of
thing.
course.
But come on, man. This is just across the board. What you're saying.
Where do you think there's more responsibility in the individual than it is to rely in medicine? And this thought comes from, or particularly with mental illness like CTE, PTSD. And last night I was watching the talk with Yusuf Salam and Raymond Santana, 2 of the exonerated 5 from the Central Park. They were here on campus. And when they were taking questions, there was a question from Divine, actually, about transitioning from someone else who was also in prison and coming out of that world into the next. And their response were living with your own permission and affirmations, and to take back your power with giving yourself things to do that you like, to reclaim what made your identity. Like, I think Raymond's response, or something that he does now, was with his clothing line, because as a child he liked to sketch. But when he was arrested from 17 and didn't get out to like 25, 26, his whole childhood was gone, and that was his way of reclaiming his identity and finding a place and how to operate and move in the real world outside of prison and everything else that happened to him psychologically in jail, coming into the real world. And
I'm sorry.
That Yusuf's response was, if you tell yourself I am, or I think it was a campaign that he started, it was I am, and then you complete it. Like, giving an example with children or anyone who's in verbal abuse. If you're talking shit to someone and telling them that they ain't gonna be shit, then that's how they're gonna feel about themselves. But if you could tell yourself, I will be something great, then you shall. So with mental health, do you think that, like the studies with medicine, is it more down to what the individual is doing with their inner selves, whether it's meditation, just all the things to work on themselves and to put into work as the individual for their own identity, as opposed to, all I gotta do is take this pill and I'll adjust to these chemicals and then I'm fixed?
There's a joke about sociologists that if you ask them to describe why something's happening, they always start off by saying it's complicated. And so that's the way I teach, but it also tends to be the way I look at things like this. So in my mind, it's both, or it's both and. Because at one level, I'm aware of the over mystification of the individual in our culture and the powers of the individual in the culture. And so fundamentally, as a sociologist in the United States, and I don't know, I think it varies in other parts of the world, but the United States, part of what I think our work is working against what a great sociologist by name Robert Wuthnow called the American mythos. So working against that individuals can always overcome by their own resources. But the other side of that is, I think, some of the truth behind what you were saying is the power of the individual when they find that vocation, or when they find that slot, or that lane, because it calls forth something in them that heals them, but I think heals them partly because it helps them heal the world outside of them. It's what a community I used to work with in Washington, D.C. called, and Joseph Campbell is this stuff too, it's the inner and the outer journey together at the same time. We have phases where sometimes it's inner and sometimes it's outer, but it's always the two of those at some level working together. Yeah, we were talking Joseph Campbell the other day, and I didn't tell you this, but I used to have painted on my car when I was in college, my old junky Ford Tempo that my grandmother gave me, "Follow your bliss," painted right on the inside of the door, and you would have gotten that.
I think a lot of it is people playing into how they think they are supposed to be. And it's interesting because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. She calls me a lot when she's having panic attacks. And I was talking to her about an experience I had seeing a therapist for the first time, because it's something I expect that I need to do with things that I've gone through. And with talking to her, leading with the most traumatic things, one of the most things that I usually start with is losing my mom when I was 16 with cancer. And after I'm talking to her about all these things, she's like, well, you seem to be handling it pretty well. And I'm like, well, I just do what I got to do, like, if I want to live. But then there are times where I'm like, well, I expect to be depressed, or there are certain emotional things or stuff that come up where I expect myself to react another way when I hear other stories, or just a general idea that I have for hurt, damaged, traumatized, whatever, people that I don't experience. So then it makes me question, well, am I strong, or is that actually a definition of knowing that I have an issue or something else to work on? My lack of emotional responses to certain things or feelings for stuff, because I expect that I should carry myself or have some type of challenges when I don't.
I have a similar thing. I lost my father when I was 9.5. He had a heart attack, and just, but it's never traumatic for me. It just wasn't. And I went through a period where I thought, okay, I must have buried some things, but I really don't think I ever did. Did I miss some things? Did I miss out on stuff? I would have had a different experience. But almost from day one, I started to say, well, this is going to be really interesting. I don't have a father. Now what's it going to be, right? And so, how is that? Is that my DNA? Did I teach myself that? I don't know. We're in the interstices of causality at this point.
And when you started talking, it's what I always tend to come back to when I hear people asking similar questions is, in the absence of our own narratives, we will inevitably live out somebody else's. So in the absence of us to be able to conceptualize and abstract or individuate who and what we are and what we believe that our behavior should be after we describe who and what we are, that if there's a stronger concept that then enters at that point where we're questioning who and what we are, just like you're talking about when a belief system collapses, right? Or when, something catastrophic happens. And I think Nietzsche talks about, when belief systems collapse, that's when you're most vulnerable to enter a new belief system. And a lot of times that's what you call catching a girl off the rebound, right? She breaks up, she breaks up with somebody, and you swoop in and you save them from the chaos of not having a structure, right? Of not having a fortified structure to be able to say who and what they are. Now that's a very small microcosm of what that is, but when belief structures collapse, then you're more vulnerable to entering a new belief structure because you've never had to swim in open space before. And so I think that's another thing that I start to think about when I think about CTE as well. When your question was about mental health, it's like as soon as you leave this structured environment, which there's no doubt about who you are, right? Doubt about who you are shows up on the field. If you don't doubt whatsoever, you can move without thinking. I can't tell you how many times a coach has told me not to think. You're thinking too much, son. Right? And it's actually a relinquishing of thought that makes you a better player on the field. It allows you to tap into instinctual movements where you're actually relinquishing thought. And now all of a sudden you're thrust into a world where thinking is mandatory. You can't think instinctually. You can't live in what Jordan Peterson, I hate to keep quoting him, but calls a prelapsarian state, a state in which humans were before consciousness, before we started questioning or realizing that there was good or bad, that we instinctually moved like animals. And in that state, it's almost like football and other sports and other performances is a representation of that, right? It's a live representation, and the closest thing that we can get to getting back to that true essence of not thinking and having a conscious thought of our suffering and of our realities, of what's good and bad, right? And so I think football exemplifies that because it's so reactionary, right? And sports in general, but it's reactionary, it's emotion, and it's emotional, and there's no long-term thinking involved, and it's incentivized to not think long-term because it takes you out of what other people would call a flow. So I think, leaving that type of environment, which is structured for you to act like that. My breakfast was scheduled. My ice tub was scheduled. My therapy was scheduled. My massage was scheduled. My meetings were scheduled, right? My car was picked up and washed. My house was cleaned. All of these things were in place in order for me to do this thing that the rest of society didn't get to do. And when you walk out of that where you didn't have to do anything that everybody else has to do outside of it, now what do I do and how do I deal with this? Who am I? How do I not know how to function? I'm a 12-year-old boy getting paid $40 million and being treated like a man and being invited into schools to talk to kids when all I really done is worn the right colors and hit people at the right time. So, well, why am I being revered? And now all of a sudden, none of that I don't have that platform anymore. And all of a sudden, those behaviors that I've cultivated, and it's more than conditioning. It's a term called shaping, where a point where you're being psychologically and biochemically shaped into a new individual based upon the constructs in which you've been more than incentivized to be by the stadium, the crowd that represents society that cheers these behaviors, but then also the money, and also within the context of a football team, you having the valor of giving up your body for the team, of talking about being on campus and slaying chicks and drinking beer. I like that part about football, which you can have those conversations within it. And I think it's beneficial to the player while he's in it to have those types of behaviors and that type of perspective. But when you leave it, right, there is really no transitional guide that none of these things apply. And I think there's a small handful of people that have that mental schism, right, and don't know how to frame what that is. And when somebody comes in with a stronger narrative that allows you to frame your issues and frame the suffering that you're going through, which is your inexplicable suffering and your inexplicable malfunctioning, well, there you go. And I think we can monetize those things sometimes.
Listen, my friend, right there, you laid out the entire project
Yeah.
very clearly.
Yeah, you got
Yeah.
it. You connected it to your story, and you're working with
Yeah.
everything there.
Because
Oh,
this is
cool.
it. This
Yeah.
is really, it's about the frame, and it's about who we're going to allow to frame things for
Yep.
us, and it's about the dangers of this population of people. And I know earlier, last year, you and I talked about how, when you're an elite player, for many elite players, this starts in 7th and 8th grade. You start to be identified as elite, and then through college and through high school. And so when you said, I'm a 12-year-old boy, yeah, 12 years old is when a lot of elite players get identified, and then everything changes. And then you just you got to take somebody's frame, and so you just take the one that's right there in front of you.
And what came to mind for me as you were talking was we've been talking about the book by Irving Goffman on asylums, and one of his great phrases in his research on this particular book was on mental health patients. Kind of, you can think one flew over the cuckoo's nest sort of facility, is that it's a total institution. And you're listing there of,
Yeah.
I'd take the scheduled massage, but everything else of, the breakfast, the car, the massage, that is a total enveloping institution that most of us, to be honest, don't ever live in. And to come out of that, which kind of leads me to a question of, so what's the good narrative? Like, so you're finding your own way. Do you know other guys that are finding ways and doing well without the CTE narrative? See, that's the hopeful side of the project to me is, they have physical and maybe mental suffering, but are there other ways in CTE to move with that? Because your suspicion is that CTE might handicap them at some way.
Well, and this is some of the notes that I wrote that I definitely wanted to get to, so I'm glad you brought this up, because what I talked about with CTE has meant for me, it's been the total opposite of the larger narrative. It has been an intellectual springboard for me, right? CTE has been an intellectual springboard for me to go question this thing and read all of these books and figure out as much as I can. It's like, well, I'm not sure if I believe this, but I'm going to read as much as I can while I have the cognitive ability before I may, I'm a ticking time bomb, and I'm going to fill myself up with as much as possible if that's true, right? And through that, I've discovered that maybe there's other answers. Maybe I don't need to be as scared as I once was. Maybe I can actually give myself more power than I thought that I had. Maybe I am legitimate enough to go back to Penn State campus and rewrite who I was here. Maybe I am legitimate enough to be able to go speak to a bunch of kids in a class, but I wouldn't have done any of that, and I wouldn't have the confidence to do any of that unless I was scared of CTE affecting me the way that it was told to me that it was going to affect me. And so it served as an intellectual springboard for me. And I do think that there are people being successful in spite of that. A lot of times when I'm living in between Toronto and LA. When I'm in LA, there's a lot of times where there's former teammates, professional and collegiate, that will be out in LA for various reasons. And they'll know I'm out there. And they'll come by the house. And they know that, like, my house is kind of like a sanctuary of gray area, right? Right, because a lot of guys within football, sometimes it's having the girlfriend, the wife, and doing the thing, and doing playing the role of football player that best integrates you with the team and with the sport. And I've always been the guy that's kind of not done that yet, still been able to perform within it, and so living in it, not of it. And I think because of that, guys would come to my house and be more comfortable with talking about. If I were to say I had suspicion about CTE, they'd be like, I was waiting for somebody to say that. And I'm like, why? Now tell me why. Because, man, I've been angry my whole life. I'm not just angry now.
Football,
exactly.
Right.
I've been angry all the time. I've been able to react and go hit somebody. I've been wanting to hit somebody since I remember. It's not just now because I'm done. And so guys, and also other guys, are I knew it because I got a teammate who used to hit his girlfriend, and now he's saying it's CTE, right? Well, I don't believe that fucker. And I'm so glad you're questioning this. So there's guys that are out there like that. There's guys that are out there that they hear what I say, but they still can't. They listen to what I say, but they can't hear it, right? Because their mind is almost made up, as if it's done, and it's almost like I'm offending them by saying you potentially have more responsibility over your behaviors than allowing somebody to tell you that you don't. And that can upset some people. And then also, there's guys out there that I think are very successful because they've had developed interests within the sport, and however that happened. And I think it's kind of the same way that I talked yesterday about, I think the reason I've been able to ride this line so well is because my identity from birth has been, are you black or are you white? And I've been questioned my whole life from myself and from people around me by being biracial. And so I don't think I've ever really taken on football player. I'm just a guy that plays ball. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, I've been able to keep, toe this line and be like, well, maybe I'm over here. Maybe I'm that. Maybe this is right. Maybe that's right. And so when guys come to my house, I think I only get the guys that will come to my house because they recognize that there may be a different opinion that they'll have when they leave, right? And I think that's kind of what my house represents wherever I'm living, LA or Toronto. But also, there's guys that I know that are successful in real estate. I know the guys that are successful. There's a teammate of mine that flies helicopters. There's a teammate of mine that is studying to be a neuroscientist, a neuropsychologist, Julius Thomas, who I've spoken to about this project already. I mean, there's some high-functioning individuals. So then another thing that I end up talking about, too, when we talk about these high-functioning individuals, Aaron Hernandez. Okay? Mm-hmm. This is a huge CTE narrative. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, they're saying CTE potentially played a part in the murders that he was convicted of committing. Well, I start to think, well, if CTE, takes away cognitive thinking, critical thinking, and motor functions, irritability, depression, anger, rage, mood swings, all these things, right? But it's supposed to take away your cognitive ability to think. I'm an NFL player, starting, Pro Bowler, on the Patriots, underneath a Bill Belichick schedule, which is different than the rest of the league. I'm also performing it, I've already said it, performing at a crazy high level, but I also killed 3 people, and I also convinced 7 other people to not say a word. And I'm still showing up to practice on time at 6 a.m. and lifting weights and running and conditioning and catching touchdowns. That seems pretty high functioning to me. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem low functioning to me at all. That seems very high functioning.
So they dissected his brain and they found evidence of CTE. Mm-hmm. And so then where do you take that?
Well, the thing is, it's like, well, then if CTE is supposed to take away your capacity to do any of these things, then what explains the ability to do all of those things?
When did it kick in?
When did it kick in?
It must have been after he was making all those really left brain rational decisions.
But that's the assumption that CTE's patterning in your brain actually does those things.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's when I speak to a neuroscientist like Dr. Rudy Castellani, who I've cut open brains with him in Western Michigan's brain bank with him. And he's like, this is what tau protein looks like right here. And you could put that on a microscope, blow it up, stain it a little bit, and say it's CTE. He's like, there's not very many people that could refute if I did that, right? And I'm like, okay. And he's like, well, this person didn't play football.
Yeah.
The brain that we're looking at, he didn't play football.
Yeah.
It's just the brain that we got here because they died of natural causes. Natural causes.
Yeah.
So the thing is, it's like, well, how far do we extend or minimize natural causes?
Yeah.
Because the thing is, it's like, okay, here's a pattern that we could call and stain and blow up and put on a slide and call it CTE, but this is tau protein that shows up in exposure to life in most of our brains. Now, did he have the behaviors that match the narrative that will then get you to buy the Will Smith movie on Amazon called Concussion? No. So nobody's interested in that brain. And so that's what kind of,
It's interesting. You got there. You're pointing out like confusion on both sides of the scientific process. One, the pattern detection, diagnose, create a symptom side that we can study, and then the side of like what does that do? Because there's just in any disease, there's a lot of variation between the individual's bodies and their environments about how that'll actually play out. And the way you talk about how players and kind of the media uses CTE, it's like everybody acts as if there's no problems on either side there around the symptomology, or I should say the pattern detection, or around the behavior. but there is. And that's
Yeah.
what's interesting to me about this project.
And I just want people to think, man.
Yeah,
I just
listen.
want them to think about it
Yeah.
and not accept narratives that are, shoved down their gullets. And I'm not saying that people aren't suffering.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that at all.
Or that it doesn't occur to some degree.
Exactly.
Somewhere it
because there is a
occurs.
genetic predisposition to cognitive decline in Alzheimer's, and that's the genetic trait of the APO4E gene.
Yeah.
And that's what I read in multiple books across different neuroscience books, from Norman Doidge to the end of Alzheimer's, written by why can't I think of his name now? Jack, you remember his name? San Francisco.
Oh shit.
We were in Marin.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
I'll picture.
See, now I can blame this on CTE.
Yeah.
What can he blame it on?
Well, and that's what I'm saying. What can he blame it on, right? So I guess, and I would love to, because I know you guys have limited time, but especially you, there were some like specific things that I know that your expertise and being the professors and the sociologists that you are, I would love to kind of ask, because I really do see this, and I hate to categorize it as like left brain, right brain, right? But I really do see, the potential in being able to extract different types of information that create this perfect swirl of investigative reasoning that will take us into that invisible layer of
Go
information.
through. So you have a few questions for us.
Yeah.
Okay, put them out there, and we'll give short answers. Gary
Okay.
has 10 minutes.
Yeah, we can get through.
All right, cool. I really appreciate
No,
that.
this-
We'll give short
Because
answers,
I'm
right?
I'm wearing this jacket so you don't see how much I'm sweating underneath this, because
your
I'm so
editor,
excited.
Your editor will be really happy if we can give you a short answer.
No, you will.
Dude,
Because
you
the
asked the
only ones that
professor
will
to give
be
a
used-
short answer. You've already made a mistake out of the gate.
So I'm just going to run through these things, and I guess we'll stop when you feel that there's something.
That's good.
I said, as a sociologist, what sociological methods could I apply to my questions that would validate my data collection and potentially provide clearer answers? That was my first question. Of behaviors being outlined in the disease, does it remind you of any other behaviors outlined in other sociological studies or theories? And I know before you brought up Durkheim, right? When he talked about leading these high status social groups, that people would contemplate or commit suicide at a higher rate because they've lost a social status. So I've got like probably about 8 questions total for you, and like 8 questions total for you. But if you could combine those two and maybe ask, as a sociologist, how could I validate my data collection and provide clearer answers? But then also in the behaviors that are being outlined in the disease, does it remind you of any other behaviors being outlined in sociological studies or theories?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first thing that comes to point in thinking about methods is that the danger in most undergraduate students, and you're still an undergraduate, most undergraduate students, they don't realize, but they trip into the danger of selecting what we call selecting on the dependent variable, which means they go after the thing that they think is actually happening and then don't have a comparison case. And we talked about this the other day. That mode of going in is good for a first stage of a project. So you've talked to enough people now that you've got that hunch of they're using CTE to understand their life after football. But this is where we were talking about, you need other groups of people within the population of former football players to compare to. And I like our conversation the other day, which we've referenced here, which is that we were thinking of who are the types of football players for whom we expect this should be happening, and who are the types of football players for whom we don't expect it should be happening. And then you got to talk to those two groups, and you can't prime them to give you the answers that you want to give. So it's just being transparent about how you select the groups to talk to, and then transparency in your interview. So you don't start off with the first question, so tell me how CTE affects you, right? Because then the interview is useless because you've already primed them about the sort of information that you want. So tell them not to listen to this podcast would be a good idea. So methodologically,
Issue with like repressing all of my conversations, because I don't want to influence people because I can't enter certain rooms then.
that's one of the hardest things I think about being even a sociologist is sometimes we have to work hard against getting too far out in front of our hunches, and and trying to see a pattern that's not there. And so I even do that in just an interview that I did this week with the research project I'm doing. Is I was walking over to do the interview, and I thought, stick with my interview guide, my schedule of questions, clear my head, and let things bubble up. And I'm glad I did that, because at the end of the interview, some stuff that came up that I wouldn't have expected to pop up. The other side of that, in terms of, there's a whole field of people out there called medical sociologists, or sociology of medicine. That book I sent you, that link to, he's a guy in that field. I'm actually not in that field at all, but they would, there's a whole host of theories that they would have to think about the way disease categories get formed, and then what interests in society latch onto them, and what people do with those once they latch onto them. A name that came to mind, and Sam probably knows her work too, Arlie Hochschild. Mm-hmm. She did some really cool writing in the 70s about what she called feeling rules, which is a little bit of what you're talking about. People are saying, I feel like I have to act like something's wrong up here, or I have to talk about CTE. Her research was on stewardesses. Back in those days, they were the cabin personnel in flights, only women. And she was interested to see, like, well, what does it take to pull off being a stewardess? And they had to do an insane amount of feeling work, always smiley, always ready to have a casual conversation, always friendly. And she was interested in what that does to people. And of course, in her case, it was a profession, being in a profession, that meant they had to follow those rules. Whereas you're studying something slightly different, which is people out of the profession now feeling like they have to pick up on rules or a narrative. So that's what comes to mind for me off the top of my head. I don't know about you.
No, go
Sam.
ahead. Go with your next question to Gary.
Yeah, do you have any?
Has to leave. That's a cool response. It's a very cool response, by the way. I really appreciate hearing you. Like, it's really nice to listen to a fellow sociologist.
It's fun. When you're doing graduate school, you think you're going to get a job and you'll be able to sit around with your colleagues all day and talk like this. And you don't.
You never do.
You're teaching, you're getting grants in, whatever. So the chances to do this stuff is fun. Yeah.
I think another thing a couple of things I wanted to ask is, in the absence of solid neuroscience, what kind of answers can a field like sociology provide us? And then, why is sociology not a more prominent field in which we seek out answers to large societal questions? It seems as though society does not consult its own field of study to find its answers. Almost feels like an individual who refuses to look inward when trying to explain away his problems.
We should invite him to the next Sociology Association meeting.
Yeah.
So your second question, and I'd love to hear Sam's thoughts on this, is an ongoing off-the-record conversation amongst sociologists, and it's been going on for decades, probably since the 60s. There was a point post-World War II where sociology, it exploded in growth and in prestige, funding, prominence, and that coincided with the era of surveys first being deployed and being able to give lots of information about a big population. But since that era, sociology is, what I love about it is the diversity within it. So you can do interviews, you can do surveys, you can do experiments, lots of stuff. And there are actually a lot of people like Sam, people who are contrary in their thinking, which makes it a field that we talk about as not as coherent as some of the natural sciences. And I think that's what yours.
Yeah, do you think that comes from because sociology may tend to give more power to people and to the large groups that are within the sociological studies?
I will tell you,
oligarchical ivory towers.
There's less of us that can monetize what we have to say. And when what you're doing is what Sam said we're doing, which is always asking about power, there's going to be a lot of people that don't want to monetize that, right? I think that's one way to think about it.
Yeah, I think the best first off, the best sociology is the stuff that can't clearly be stated and understood. Just to really fully understand the classic studies in sociology, it's a lot, man. It takes a lot.
Yeah.
So you can't easily just say what it is. And when I listen to the sound bites that come out from what are actually really interesting studies, research, the sound bites just don't do justice to
Yeah.
it. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's the fundamental difficulty of a social science is that we are studying people and processes that can act back towards us.
Yes.
And that is totally different than what natural scientists are trying to do with their science. So we are, their subjects can't talk back to them. And
They're not living in it.
They're not living in it. And so what we're trying to do while studying something is try and get a handle on everything that's around that something. And that's really, it's really difficult to do, to be honest. And you're never done as a sociologist. I don't know if you feel that way, Sam,
Yeah.
but I always feel that way. Like I always feel like I'm trying to figure
But
out.
I always
how
feel
to-
like no matter what I say, I get it wrong.
Yeah, me too.
I miss something. I miss
Yeah.
something really important.
Yeah.
And so it becomes like this thing where,
Yeah.
you made a joke about, Gary, about how we start off every explanation with, well, it's complicated. That just gives us time to think about all the things that we don't know and we can't say.
Yeah. These are good questions.
So in the absence of solid neuroscience, what kind of answers can sociology give us, if there's something to compare there?
We can give a lot of answers, and I think some of the most powerful answers we give are sustained debates around core ideas. For example, that hidden power and social conflict exist. We've been arguing about that for a couple hundred years, but we keep coming back to it because we know societies always are facing hidden power and social conflict. And the nature of those processes change in each era. They change in countries, they change in communities. And so there's always a need to kind of revisit those basic questions. At the same time, I do think one of the most important things we do in training sociologists is talking about methods, because we don't do neuroscience methods, right? We don't slice and dice here. There's some people that look at fMRIs and emotions and things, but most sociologists are interviewers or surveyors, and in that type of evidence that we bring forward, it's not the sort of evidence that you can say 100% certainty. And I actually think that's a strength we have, because I think it leads or at least I hope it leads to some humility that we could be wrong, and that we need other people kind of checking us on that. Yeah.
Then I had questions about, why did you tell me to read the book Asylums?
Yeah.
After hearing what I had to say.
It's a great book.
And then, why did you tell me to read the book about life after prison? I forget the name of that one specifically. But it was Asylums and the Life After Prison, because then I wanted to. That's when we already brought in Sebastian Younger and the soldier experience, and I wanted to kind of unite the prisoner, soldier, and football player experience, and being released from these structures that structure everything about us, and then we come back into something that's totally different. And I didn't know if that had anything to do with those two books.
Yeah, the Asylum it's just, Irving Goffman is one of the great American sociologists and invents the study of framing. So a lot of people actually know Lakoff. You're right, and Lakoff does some framing. But among sociologists, Goffman is probably one of the most important, where he writes a whole book called Framing, where he talks about how we frame, how we cut our social situations and contexts has everything to do with how you feel about who you are. And so he used to, apparently he was, like many sociologists, an oddball. He would mess with people in his own department. He'd go into the elevators and just stare up at the numbers, or look at people while they were staring at the numbers. Try doing that in the elevator, you'll scare people, right? And that was part of his style. And so I think he can make some profound, he draws profound lessons in an era that wasn't so hyper empirical. So some of his stuff is really just news clippings and casual observations. We live in a different era now, for better or for worse, where you can't kind of be that loose, but he could do it really well. The other book, I don't know that I told you about, but I think you might really like, it's from this conversation, is George Simmel, a German sociologist, has this really cool short chapter called The Stranger. Yeah, we can email it about it, where he is interested in the unique qualities basically the foreigner, of the other, as some people might call it, which is that when they walk into town, we're all interested in them, and we're all a little threatened by them. Because they could have a gift, or they could have a weapon. And that role, and he looks at it as a social role, can create chaos, but it can also create transformation. And a lot of what you're talking about is this stuff. Yeah.
High plains drifter.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
It's
that
my
sort of
favorite
stuff.
movie.
Yeah.
My dad passed it down to me. High Plains Drifter.
Yeah.
He's literally called the stranger.
Yeah.
He walks into town. He
Yeah.
blows in with the tumbleweeds,
Yeah.
and he is automatically given this godlike power by everyone.
Yeah.
He is the decider of everyone's fate
Yeah.
because he cannot be described. And this town is in shambles, and they're threatened by these three
Yeah.
bandits.
Yeah.
And he comes in off the bat. He shoots 3 people and
Yeah.
kills them.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Well, why'd you do that?" And they're like, "Well, because you wouldn't." And they're like, "Well, you're right. Well, what should we do?" And he decides the fate of the town.
Yeah.
And that's exactly that. So I definitely am going to read that.
Yeah. That's a short one. I could give
my
you gobs
God.
and gobs of stuff to read, but yeah. Anyhow.
That's perfect. And then I think the last thing I was asking is like, because throughout this it seems like Boston University, BU, has created a perfect study and lab to get them the results that they want, taking deceased football players and looking for CTE without having a control group in their main study. And, what do you make of that? And because when you call that out, like a guy like Merrill Hodge, who's a former football player who wrote a book called Brainwashed, got tons of backlash for being a CTE, science, and compassion denier.
Yeah.
And he took a lot of bullets for that. I interviewed him too.
Yeah.
But he's a bit more. He's very hard.
Well, if you notice, you were doing the same thing in your project, right? It was the selecting on the dependent variable thing, and that's a way that's an important tool in science because you can focus on the shared characteristics of a phenomenon. I don't know that field at all, but my hunch would be that might be where the decade ahead is in brain science, is more brains that we don't know where they came from, or they're random, or they're specifically not people that had histories of head trauma, and lots more of those to see are there other pathways to similar outcomes, or is it really that the case that repeated head trauma really does have a propensity to generate this more often? That's my own sense. I don't want to question their science because I haven't looked at it, and from what little I've heard, it seems pretty interesting stuff. I think we should go after it, because if there is an answer there, then wouldn't we want to know that answer?
Of course.
Yeah.
You said you would what?
I have another question. Is clear perception has a lot of influence on human behavior, and I think those have a lot to do with. I think that's a factor in invisible strains with like suicide rates. And what I was saying, like, I think I'm supposed to feel this way or have this pattern because it's what I expect when I have an experience or identify as this. Is it considered in social sciences, or if you know about in neuroscience, about just the base foundation of the fact that as human beings, we're organic, natural creatures, and there are just some corners in nature that are unpredictable and we just shouldn't, and will not understand?
Yeah, that's a really
great
cool question. And
We're natural and organic, but there's a cool book from about 15 years ago that also is titled Moral Believing Animals. And this sociologist is my sense is trying to work in that space between those.
Yeah, I take a lot from Maps of Meaning in Jordan Peterson, and when he talks about the structures of making a belief system, and when he breaks down making these structures, it's like we need these things. There are things outside of the structures in which structure our identity, our thoughts, our beliefs, and the grids in which we exist. There are things out there, but there's not a lot of people that can exist out there for too long or forever, and that we need to frame something somehow, or else our minds are gnarled by our constant questioning of the reality of existence, or however you want to put any type of super existential question. And that's kind of so when I start to think about things that are left to the unknown is essentially the God element. And I always think it's interesting in the stage and in a period where we're watching the structures that are supposed to represent what God is, like watching, I think we talked about that, watching Notre Dame burn and seeing that over and over again as the nightly news with Lester Holt comes on. It's a part of the cycle. Every time he comes on, it's World Trade Center falling. It's Notre Dame burning. It's these huge structures that create belief within us of who and what we are as a society that I think have a metaphysical, this thing that you can't see or explain, but that is real and that exists and that affects us, a metaphysical effect on us seeing those images over and over again and the meaning that those structures represent, and that then those meanings are diminished, like God is being diminished, these things that we won't know, right? These things that we won't know, and leaving it to the things that we won't know, that construct of having that, well, there's some things that we won't know, and leaving that there is being kind of deteriorated by these images of the structures that held and conducted that God element for a very long time. So we're kind of in this kind of like diaspora of ideas that will help, that try to align us, right? We're in this upside down world of trying to figure out who and what we are, because these old structures that encompassed our beliefs of who and what we were collectively and individually are burning down. So
That's not nearly as much coverage on the Amazon.
No. Hey, so you need to go.
I gotta roll.
Yeah, thanks
thanks
for...
Thanks, you guys. This has been great.
I really appreciate this.
We'll be in touch
Yeah.
next week. All right, enjoy tomorrow as much as you can. I want to hear your reflections on when the stranger comes back into town.
Yeah.
I mean, because you're now a stranger.
Oh, I'm telling you, I'm wearing all black and see you white.
Yeah.
Enough said.
Are,
All right.
are you going to the game tomorrow?
I am. Yeah.
I'll be there too.
All right, cool.
What would you be wearing?
I'm in a whiteout section, so
All right. There you go. I will see
Thank you
guys.
so much.
right,
I
see
really
you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, I will not be there. So.
well, you're never there.
I did go last. No, I went to the game on Saturday against Buffalo.
You did?
Yeah, I was excited. They were losing at the half because I said, "Well, this is going to be a really good second half."
Yeah.
You never go to games.
No, I did go. It had been about 7 years since I had been to a game, but
And you never told me.
no, I didn't tell you.
You didn't tell anyone that you were
Before any of our time.
No, I told the person I was with, but hey, so listen, how much time do you all have to?
2:30 when our meeting is.
All right, listen, let's do some
I
questions.
got questions for you.
Yep, and then are you good? Darnisha, Joy, we're good.
I mean, I'm trying to get a tattoo, but technically I'm not doing like 3.
All right, okay, we're good then. All right, let's go. Yep. Okay. If anyone's still watching the stream, this is a really fascinating conversation. It's really nice to be able to sponsor it as part of the Social 19 podcast, because I think it gives us a different flavor of some really fascinating ideas about sociology that I never go into. So.
Speaking of sponsoring, this is sponsored by World in Conversation, so go out in the world and conversate. I do that every episode now.
All right.
Cool.
Several times, by the way. That's your first time. All right, so let's go. J.O., kick it out.
So, what do you think I'm not seeing? Are there more positive aspects to scientists that support the idea of pumping CTE narratives and awareness, who are trying to create a pharmaceutical that my potential bias is not allowing me to see? What is my potential bias not allowing me to see? Is there anything positive that I'm missing here that people do?
Well,
that
listen.
I'm missing.
Okay, so your potential bias, so you definitely have bias, right? As we all do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the bias that you have is actually what's driving you forward, and it's not going to, and it's actually driving the thought system forward, a different kind of framework. So it's in some ways it's kind of best that you just kind of hang on to the bias that you have. It's not big, it's not extreme, but it's enough to keep you going, because it's enough to to keep you asking the kinds of questions that other people are not asking. So the issue is that if you are not careful in accounting for all the really clear cases of something that's going on, we're going to call it CTE right now, right? Even though in an ideal world, what would happen is we'd get a few years down the road, people would take thinkers like you seriously, take these other ideas seriously, and then they would come up with a new name for what is clearly a physiological response, the brain's physiological response to getting knocked around. Like, so something's happening there, right? But they would give it a new name. It wouldn't be CTE. Because CTE, in some ways, if you're right, CTE has already been just mislabeled and misused and inappropriately kind of, hang on. I want to say this because this is actually a good soundbite. If you're correct in some of your hypotheses, then we won't be using CTE as the label for what is actually going on with players, because we'll look back and we'll say, hey, CTE is what we used to call it, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because we've taken these other ideas, these sociological ideas and thoughts, and we've integrated them into this new sort of neurological, these patterns that we're seeing, and we have to change it somehow, right? We have to change the way we're thinking. So I don't think I think you're on point, but they'll come after you hard because they said that's what they do, man. Yeah, that's what they do. So they'll come up with all the examples where they'll find, like you're saying up at Boston University, right? They're going to find the brains that clearly have this thing, and then they're going to go. But you got to account for not having it. Mm. That's the thing. Yeah, that's PTSD. Same thing. I get students for the past 20 years are coming back who have PTSD. Or say they have, or they do. I don't ever.
You don't want to deny
that.
Suffering, but at the same time,
But I got other ones who don't, and I'm like, man, hang on a second, what's going on here? And so what we do is we just have this one label. We call it PTSD. But I'm saying, well, what is non-PTSD? What's this other thing then? That's equally as interesting. In fact, it's more interesting that somebody could go through what this person's gone through and not experience anything. Yeah. Joy. Right? Your experience with losing your mother, my experience with losing my father. Like, how do you not suffer from that? How do you not struggle from that? So, anyway.
I appreciate that. That's, it brings up a term that an old mentor of mine had brought into my purview, which was anti-fragility. Yeah. Right? And, and talking about, like, there was never a word that went past resiliency, right? Resiliency is like taking things on but not being affected, where anti-fragility is taking things on and getting bigger because of them, right? That you're anti-fragile, that you don't break because of the things being thrown at you, but you actually absorb them and get bigger.
Listen, so I will say, as a college instructor, so I've been teaching for 33 years, I think now, 34 years. And so we talk about this in the world, right? Students are more fragile today, the helicopter parenting, one thing after another. Students are more needy, students are less likely to take responsibility for themselves. Everybody complains, right? But everybody complains about everything, right? Yeah. The young people of today will be the downfall of civilization, or whatever it is that we do, right? So I'm really reticent to take that on. I rarely criticize students. I mostly think they're not very different today than they were when I was an undergrad. And that's a long time ago. However, there is some kind of there's something going on that involves people not taking basic responsibility for themselves, and that I can't deny. It's real. Something's happening. Yeah. And so that leads me to think that there are these big structures in play that that are impacting us in these really
that facilitate
complex ways.
those. That's what I begin to think, is that these large, it's a part of structural functionalism. Well, if we can create incentive for a lack of responsibility of the individual, then they fall into our hands, right? Of us creating the idea that we can monetize.
Yeah.
That creates the reasoning for them not to take
Yeah.
responsibility. So,
Well, and at some level at the university, we're monetizing the fact that these are, this is like we're all sort of in this role of loco parentis, right? And we build those structures out.
Yeah.
And we make the dormitories more like really high, fancy hotel rooms.
yeah,
And we make, the whole thing. And so, and then we get more money for it. Then we say, like, oh, well, if I build it as a hotel room, it costs me a certain amount of money, but I can charge more and I'll get my return on my investment back sooner. And like, oh, this is awesome. So, yeah, it's.
And then I think I said this earlier. I said no matter how prevalent CTE may be, CTE has actually been the opposite of cognitive decline for me. It's been an intellectual springboard. It's foisted these conversations upon me and other people around me, and it's made me jump through intellectual hurdles to really try to figure out and put language to the articulation of my experience. And I've been super appreciative about it. And so I know that we already went through that. And then another thing I had mentioned that I really wanted to mention to you was media seems to make stories as big a catalyst for change, regardless of science, and that focuses on stories.
Yeah.
Right? Where, you talk about it in a lot of your classes that I've witnessed, where it's just the stories that are compelling don't necessarily need to, match scientific analysis, yet they're embedded in our collective beliefs about what is.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you see other mechanisms of that.
Well, the one key thing to think about here, it's just, I'm not so sure it fits into what you're doing, but if it's things become news because they're rare. What you see on the news, whatever you see on the news, you don't have to be afraid of because it doesn't happen very much. And so, but the irony is, what we do is we see things on the news and then we're immediately afraid of it, right? Which is just odd, since it's the opposite.
And we're attracted to novelty. That's one thing in neuroscience they talk about.
Yeah.
Is our brains are actually constantly seeking novelty because it's the exact thing that gives us serotonin.
Okay, so yes, exactly. So now take the kinds of think about the conversation that we had here, and as Gary's talking about all the three of us, right? Now you got to take that conversation and you want to package it up and you want to give it to somebody. You want to turn it into a documentary. You want to turn it into a movie. You want to put it on the front page of the New York Times. Whatever it is that you want to do, good luck with that. And so your question about why is it that sociologists, our perspectives aren't really leading the news cycles? Well, because we can't package them. I mean, nobody wants to really focus on it, and so we get stuck, right? And you're just not so your project, as fascinating as it is, certainly from a sociological perspective, while questioning power, questioning reality, questioning life as we think it is or should be or whatever the case is, it's going to take a lot. It's unlikely that a big, huge audience is going to be able to take the time to filter through some rather complex arguments. And then you're asking them to swim upstream while thinking. And man, that's just going to be really hard. It's way easier to just say, oh yeah, football players, we get our heads knocked around and there's brain damage and then, these unfortunate consequences occur.
There's a Will Smith movie about it.
Yeah, it's very. If there's a Will Smith movie about it, it's black and white. It's very simple.
Yep.
That's Hollywood. That's what they're going to do. They're not going to do anything that's complex.
And I think I've been surprised by how many people I've interacted with and asked simple questions. Because I think one of the biggest things that led me to start this project was when I would tell people, "I'm done playing football." Right? It's like, oh, it was like. a random occurrence or a stranger, like, they'd walk up on you and they'd look and see your body tag, and you're like, "You play football or something?" "Yeah, I used to." "Oh, so you're done?" "Yeah." Next thing they do is, "How's your head?"
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm like, "Wait, what do you mean?" And they're like, "Well, that Will Smith movie, man. Like,
Yeah.
how can you deny that?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Well, I can deny it because it's like, are you worried about the Avengers, saving you from?" I said, "Now, understood. It's a representation of of real stories, but the thing is that if you're downloading the truth from a movie with Will Smith in it, what was that's one thing for the bystander or citizen, the average citizen, to be thinking about, but it's another when a former football player who's worried about CTE starts to download feelings of cognitive decline from that film.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, what you're raising is, well, if you've never really built up your social and psychological sense of self, a structure around you, a structure within which you operate in your life and you make sense of life, then, well, you're going to have decline. Of course you are. People have decline when they retire from their jobs. I mean, this is crazy. It's everything. Hey, so I have a question for you, though.
Yes.
Have you ever actually added up all the numbers of players starting in high school and then college and then the pros and thought, if you look at all these players, and everybody gets concussions, right? I played ball for 6 years. I probably had 2 concussions, and I've had maybe 4, maybe 5 dingers. So those are minor, those small concussions, right? So that's 7 total. That's just me. I played 6 years. Come on, man. Yeah, I start adding up all the people, and then think about how many cases of CTE we should be seeing, and are we seeing what are we seeing those kinds of numbers?
No.
So there's one of those questions that I'm asking all the time. So when I did the thing with, I add up the number, 39 million black people in the United States. How many in 1 year were murdered by the police or killed by the police? I mean, killed. Let me not use the word murder. That's like a heightened, right? We're killed by the police. And it's like, well, the chances of a person being killed by, let's just look at the numbers. It's not even to add any interpretation of those numbers, right? So adding up the numbers of, and that's just basketball. What about other sports? What about other careers, other things? Okay. Anyway, so that's a thought that I have that would be really interesting.
And then I think I had 2 more questions here, or 2 more kind of statements to kind of, how valid is my assessment of sociology being more spiritual than we think, being the connective tissue in between heavily regurgitated empirical fields of study?
Yeah, I think if you're a really top-notch sociologist, you see the spiritual, you see the connectivity. And the reason is because it's a spiritual endeavor, right? Because you see when I talk about as the invisible strings of that are connecting us and shaping our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings in ways that we will never see. Well, to accept that is happening means that we have to accept that we're on a journey, the likes of which we're not in control of. And it doesn't mean to give causality or give control to an external force that people would call God or something, but it means to give causality or ascribe causality to factors and forces that maybe have been being put in play for the billions of years of evolution, and I'll never see and I'll never understand. And that's a really, really cool kind of just way of seeing the world. That's my spirit. That's my spiritual focus, by the way.
Yeah.
I would say that sociology in many ways is my spiritual drive.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool, and I think that's what's so attractive for me, and I'm sure it's probably attractive, if I may say, for a lot of other students, because I think, you go on a dating website, right? You go on, whether it's Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, any of these things, you see people putting on their profile, where it puts religion. It seems like people are scared to put, or don't want to put, or don't have anything to put in religion.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I see spiritual all the time. Spiritual.
all the time.
Spiritual.
What is that?
What
does that even
what is
mean?
spiritual?
Yeah.
Well, I do yoga. And I like to think. And I'm like,
Yeah.
But isn't that every normal human being doesn't everyone like to think?
well, that's, not everybody likes to.
No.
Not everybody
Most
likes
of us
to.
don't.
People like to think about what they want to think about. That's the thing.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah.
And sometimes that relinquishes thinking, And so when you started talking about, things that can't be explained, well, that's what thinking is, right? And when you create the box and automate, right, it's like we have to automate things. If I thought about the existence and the make of my socks in the morning, I'd never put my shoes on and leave the house, right? If I thought about which route should I get to work today or to school, I have to automate these things in order for me to become a multivariate individual. In order for me to do multiple things in one day, I have to automate some of these things about my life. It's just that some of us are unwilling to automate some of the larger questions that allow us and facilitate these thoughts that actually are thinking, that question things that allow us to function enough, but also to not function enough where we can actually sit there and think. And so, and then I guess my last thing that I would have to say, and I'd love if you have time or any questions left over, but more than sparking my curiosity and questioning of the narratives placed upon me, CTE has brought me back here to finish my degree and help legitimize my search for answers. And once again, I think it's become a catalyst for positive change for me. And I think I've made it that. I feel like I've had some influence over that. Now, maybe it's something that's embedded in me by my mother or my father. My father questions everything. My father's to categorize him, just to frame people's thinking for my father, he's a black Republican who also is unemployed. Right? So is he
unemployable or just
no, he's not
unemployed?
unemployable. It's he's either overqualified or underqualified for everything, right?
Yeah.
And it allows him to think. And he's like this family sage that people go to in and around their family to speak to about esoteric things. And he's there to speak to you about that.
Yeah.
And sometimes as children of his, we get upset because it's like, Dad, how do I build a house? How do I do stuff with my hands? It's like, well, I can give you a theory about how to do stuff like, well, like I want to know how to go do it, Dad. How do I build a business? Well, business is a very interesting concept. And so, or whether I got it from my mom. And my mom, she doesn't take shit from anybody, and her hands are constantly busy. She was the one hitting me in the morning. Get up, Jared. Go to school. What is wrong with you? Get up. You're going to be late. Right? And she taught me routine. She taught me hard work. She taught me humility. She taught me a bunch of different things that I think really propelled a football career. And that I think I'm repurposing now as well. So it's like whether it's that, whether it's those things that were instilled in me, I feel like I had some decision to make what CTE meant to me, and it's brought me here, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to do all of this, but then also to be back here doing something that I was probably avoiding these past 2 years, which is finishing my degree.
Yeah, it's good to have you do that. There are a lot of, you'd be surprised at the number of people, not just athletes, the number of people who get to their final semester or their final 1 or 2 classes and they stop. And they just can't do it. You had a reason because you're just busy doing your stuff, right? Well, I mean, if we had online classes and you could take the one final sociology class online, I'm sure you'd have done it a long time ago. But people just stop. They just can't allow themselves to take a step out of graduation. Then they leave here, and then 20, 30 years later, they still don't have a degree. It's crazy. I can't even begin to count the number of people.
Really? So I'm not alone.
Yeah, no, not at all. No, you're alone in the fact that you were really busy working and doing things.
Yeah.
Yeah, other folks are just, yeah. So, no, it's awesome that you are, have taken the road less traveled and the road of the thinker. So clearly you've always been a thinker, right? Like me, I thought, but I didn't, my thinking didn't kick in until I was 20. And I decided, I wasn't a thinker at 20, but I decided at that point I was going to be one. And then it took me until I was 32. I think I told you yesterday I was teaching a class on institutions. Actually, I guess I was 31. And that was the semester I realized that I actually was a thinker, and that I was no longer relying on other ideas, other theories, other people. I stopped reading sociology texts and books and studies. I just came onto my own ideas, and from that time I've been using my own ideas. Most of the stuff that Gary was talking about today, I kind of heard of it through the pipeline, but I stopped reading all that stuff when I was in graduate school. And today all I do is read data. And that's all I need. I need data, and I need to see the world and look at the world, but every idea that I put out in the world is my own. Well, it's not my own. Most of them, actually my best ideas are my wife's, and because she's the brilliant thinker. And then I turn around. I mean, her mind is just, it's just unbelievable. And then she's in the middle of all this work. All of my best ideas about race and race relations and culture and stuff come from her.
Yeah.
And then I take it and I use it and I say, oh, that's what's going on. Okay. And then I go out in the classroom and I talk about stuff, and people will say, oh, Sam Richards. Oh, well, some people will say he's an idiot, but other people will say, well, that's such a cool idea. And I think, yeah, well, that's because it's hers,
Yeah.
But, so you have taken that road, and you're saying, I'm going to do this on my own. And all these studies, the things that you're referencing, there's no rhyme or reason behind every book or every writer or every thinker that since we started talking, now it's been almost 2 years, right? Everybody that you ever referenced for me, I try to put them, all right, where do they go somewhere, right? Usually it's kind of like, all right, you can sort of put it in place somewhere, but it doesn't for you. It's just like you just come up with the stuff that just comes out of nowhere. And I think, okay, that's the mark of someone who is really taking into account, or it's the actions of a person who's taking into account thinking itself, just ideas for the sake of ideas. And mostly we don't do that anymore. And I think you're driven, you're naturally inclined to be a sociologist because you're so fascinated with the social world. But you're mostly fascinated, it seems to me, in ways that I rarely see, actually. The interstices of sociological thinking, all the stuff that's in between the lines. So it's really, it's cool. It's great. So good. It's awesome that you're doing it. This project is, it's such a really fascinating sociological study. It comes off as a neurological one, but it's actually sociological. And I think that increasingly, that's the mark of it. That's the power of it. Is its ability to speak to sociological processes and phenomena. And I want to make sure the three of you get a chance to just ask a question here or make a comment about.
Well, I have a question from the stream, and I don't know how much it has to do with what we've been talking about, but he's been here since 12 o'clock. And so I think,
is this Jake?
No, it's Mogul.
Okay, go ahead.
He's asked a few times, is religion antithetical to science?
Yeah, I saw that question. I thought it would be good for you to answer that.
Is religion antithetical to science?
Yeah, and antithetical, opposite, that kind of a thing.
I don't believe so. Yeah, I don't believe so at all. I mean, I think people can make it that, and I think people can stand in opposition of both of them. But I think that's one thing that I'm really trying to explore by reading neuroscience book, and then also reading stuff like Kabbalah, right? Is where you're reading these esoteric texts or the interpretations of them, and then also seeing the same exact representations within neuroscience and within scientific calculations that represent the same things. And now I'm trying to think of the exact things that would pop up, but it's kind of like, they were in Norman Doidge's book, the Brain That Changes Itself. He talks about identifying certain types of therapies that people can put themselves into that end up changing their behaviors, but also not just that, but the actual tissue of their brain. And by going through different functions of therapy, that a person that puts themselves, he starts, I think, to analyze therapy that somebody takes on themselves and takes themselves through, whether we're talking physical therapy or emotional therapy, versus the person that has like court mandated therapy, right? And that there's a difference in recovery and ability and cognitive capacity for those people that actually willingly step into the therapy and that do the therapy, as opposed to it being passive, that it's active therapy, and that there's differences in your brain tissue when you actually take part in the therapy, as opposed to it's somebody doing it to you or for you. And that falls right into place with Joseph Campbell's hero, in Hero with a Thousand Faces, and the hero's journey, that the hero who's willingly going into the underworld or into the forest, into the belly of the beast, in all of these allegory that we see cross-culturally, where they go into this deep, dark place in which people are told not to go, and they go willingly, and they pack a bag, they pack an empty bag, and they say, I'm going to go to that fucking abyss. Sorry, I'm going to go to that abyss, and I'm going to go grab whatever is down there, and I'm going to bring it back. And then they come back. That hero is able to bring more back because he is willingly and understandingly so stepping into the dark areas in which other people refuse to go, right? That he can actually bring more boon back to restore society than the unwilling participant who's thrown into darkness. Although that person can still come and bring something back, he talks about the hero's biggest task is translation. And the hero's biggest task is translation, is translating the experiences that you had of going into that dark side and bringing it back to the people who have not, will not, or won't, or not capable of taking that journey into that dark part of the forest, facing the wolf in the forest, or the beast, or the going into the belly of the beast, or the whale at the bottom of the ocean, or whatever these dark places are. And so when you start to see in allegory, right, and in story, the same thing that neuroscientists are studying, and how you can actually really affect and change your brain tissue, you start to see these connective pieces in between storytelling and neuroscience. People studying numbers and affecting tissue and doing actual things that are empirically driven versus allegorical and driven by narrative. And they do the same things for an individual, right? You just calculate them different, but the behaviors end up changing, and it helps people feel aligned. So I don't think that they're opposites. No, I think that people tend to stand in opposition of these things, so they feel that they have something to fight. Because I think a lot of people, especially in Western civilization, don't feel like they wake up with something to fight, and so they create that. There's no war at your front door. There's food everywhere. There's Wi-Fi everywhere. There's clothes. We have to deal with obesity more than we have to deal with actual hunger. And I live in LA, and I see poor people refusing bottled water and food all the time, which is kind of nuts. And they've got faster Wi-Fi than me because they're camped outside of Google headquarters. So
Crazy.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Listen, man, ask him.
We have like 15 minutes before our staff meeting starts. Do you think
I got a meeting too. So
do you think 103 is open?
I'll
I can just set
go
them up.
check on it right now.
Okay.
Do Do you have Darnisha? Do you have a question first?
Wait 1 second.
I had more of a thought,
Okay.
than a question. It's kind of both. Like, you're coming back to finish your degree, and like thinking about it, most NFL players, most drafted like sports people, they're like taken out like their like junior, their senior year before they can actually finish that degree. Like, do you think it might be helpful for them to like, it might be like a mandate for like the NFL, for whatever sports league, whatever it is, to like have you finish that degree before you're entered, just so you have like a tiny bit of a plan after you're done with football? Because no one can play football, soccer, rugby, whatever for the rest of their lives. That's just not a thing that's possible. So like, do you think that could be something that would be good for?
What's the bottom line for something like an NFL or an NBA or any other sports league?
What do you
What do you think that they what's their objective? What do they want?
Well, I know a lot of people, they go to their colleges because they got drafted for football. They're not really thinking about that degree, but at the same time, you have to think about long-term things because...
Sure, the individual does, but what does that large conglomerate want? What does the NFL, NBA, or soccer league want? What do they want, separate from...
Like, knowing they want people to play football for as long as they possibly can.
Yeah, but not really. They actually want a high turnover rate because you keep them cheap that way. You don't want them to keep them playing for a long time. You want Tom Brady's to serve as these cultural icons, but the way the NFL makes their money, or keeps their money, I should say, is by having a high turnover rate. It's by having young people who perform early and cheaply, and then either wear out or find a way to devalue them, where only 10% really get super high valuable contracts, lucrative contracts. So I asked that question because, sure, you'd love to see fully functional individuals come in and out of these leagues, but the bottom line is that these leagues, in order for them to survive, it's purely or survive or thrive and grow is purely economical. It's not there's morals in it, but the morals are overshadowed by economic bottom lines. So the thing is that then the individual has to take it upon himself to be able to arm himself. Like, I had a different set of morals and principles when I was within the game, because it facilitated me playing. Like, I had to be ignorant of everything on campus. I had to be ignorant of other students while I was here. I had to be ignorant of everybody else and all the other functions in order to facilitate me to keep playing, right?
Yeah.
So I do think it would be interesting to have something like that, but mandated? Can you make a business that provides entertainment mandate that, that would kind of be counterintuitive to the business and to the sport, right? Because then it's like you're taking away precious, valuable years. You can do, I could do totally different things with my body when I was 21, 22 than I can do when I'm 31, right?
Hey, we got to cut, actually.
Sorry.
We're getting thrown out of the room
Long-
by my boss,
long-winded.
and who happens to also be my wife. So, hey, thanks, everybody. If you stayed on, Mogul, I think you were on the whole time. Like, amazing.
Yeah,
But
thanks, dude.
Thanks for being part of it. Thanks for the three of you. You'll be back on the mics next week. Thank you, bro.
Thank you so much.
Gentlemen. And it's been killer. It's been a really awesome conversation. Peace.